Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil as they follow the road laid out by the American pageant, occasionally taking unexpected turns to explore the side paths history often hides.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're looking into how England got started with colonizing North America. It's interesting, isn't it? Spain and Portugal were already there for decades before England really, made a lasting mark.
That's right. And it wasn't like they weren't interested. England definitely had ambitions early on.
But something held them back or changed?
A whole set of circumstances, really. We've got quite a lot to draw on. Personal letters, official papers, you name it.
So today, we want to unpack those factors. What really shaped those first English colonies, especially in the South?
Exactly. Looking at early attempts like Roanoke gives us clues, but Jamestown is where it finally sticks. And to understand why, we really need to step back and look at the bigger picture in Europe.
Okay, so where do we start? What was happening back in England and Europe that set the stage?
Well, a huge piece of this is the English Reformation.
Right, the break from the Catholic Church.
Precisely. This created a really strong Protestant identity in England and a lot of hostility towards Catholic powers, especially Spain.
So religion became a reason, or maybe an excuse, for challenging Spain in the Americas.
It definitely provided a powerful justification. Competing with Spain, spreading Protestantism, these were strong motivators, even alongside the more obvious economic goals.
Okay, so religious identity is one factor. What else?
Well, you also have England itself becoming more unified internally, politically speaking, under monarchs like Elizabeth I.
Despite religious tensions within England.
Yes, it's a bit of a paradox. The state was consolidating power, but there were still deep religious divides. And actually, the next century, the 1600s, was pretty unstable, civil wars and all that.
How did that instability affect colonization?
It kind of pushed people out. Religious dissenters, like the Puritans heading north or Catholics looking for refuge in places like Maryland, saw the colonies as an escape. Same for people struggling economically.
So the colonies became a sort of safety valve for England's problems.
That's one way to look at it, yeah. And then you absolutely have to talk about the Spanish Armada in 1588.
The big naval battle. That seems like a turning point.
Oh, it was huge, psychologically and practically. Defeating the Armada didn't just boost English pride and naval confidence. It signaled that Spain wasn't invincible.
It made crossing the Atlantic seem less risky.
Less dominated by Spain, certainly. It really opened things up for English ventures, fueled that imperial ambition.
And people were actively promoting this ambition back in England.
Definitely. You have figures like Richard Hakluyt, the younger one, writing things like his Discourse on Western Planting.
What was he arguing?
Basically, laying out all the reasons why England should colonize: economic benefits, new resources, new markets, strategic advantage against Spain, and of course the goal of converting indigenous peoples to Protestant Christianity. It was a comprehensive pitch.
Covering all the bases: God, gold, and glory, essentially.
Pretty much. And this all fits into the economic thinking of the time, which was mercantilism.
Okay, explain mercantilism briefly.
In a nutshell, nations believed wealth, especially gold and silver, was finite. So power came from maximizing exports, minimizing imports, and accumulating wealth. Colonies were key to this.
How so?
They were seen as sources of raw materials England didn't have, and captive markets for English manufactured goods. It was about creating a self-sufficient economic system.
And after 1604, when England made peace with Spain,
the focus shifted. Instead of just raiding Spanish ships and settlements, the idea became establishing their own permanent productive colonies, a more long-term strategy.
Right. But getting those colonies established wasn't straightforward. Roanoke is the classic example, isn't it?
Absolutely. Roanoke really highlights the early struggles. Sir Walter Raleigh's first attempt in 1585 had multiple goals: a base against Spain, finding gold, maybe a route to Asia, converting locals.
But it fell apart.
Yeah, lack of supplies, really bad relations with the local Secondton and Croatoan people. Things got violent.
I remember reading they actually beheaded a local chief. That couldn't have helped.
Definitely not. It poisoned the well, you could say. Then the second attempt in 1587, the one led by John White. That's the famous lost colony.
Where White goes back to England for supplies and returns to find everyone gone.
Exactly. Just the word Croatoan carved on a post and CRO on a tree.
Which has led to endless speculation. The mystery is compelling.
It is, but the focus on the mystery can kind of obscure the probable causes. Poor planning again, supplies delayed by the war with Spain, and fundamentally broken relationships with the indigenous people they relied on.
So less mystery, more mismanagement, and bad diplomacy.
Likely, yes. Though Roanoke failed, it did sort of feed into this narrative of English resilience, this idea that they'd eventually figure it out.
What lessons should they have learned from Roanoke?
Several key things. You need serious, reliable financial backing. You need dependable supply lines. You need a realistic plan for feeding yourselves, not just hoping for gold. And crucially, you need a better approach to indigenous relations, whether that's finding a way to coexist peacefully or establishing clear dominance.
Did they learn? Did Jamestown show improvement?
Some lessons, yes. The Virginia Company, which backed Jamestown, was a joint stock company spreading the financial risk. That was a step forward.
And alongside these human challenges, there was the invisible impact of disease.
Yes, and this is devastating. European diseases like smallpox, influenza, indigenous populations had no immunity.
The death rates were catastrophic, weren't they?
Horrifyingly high, sometimes up to 90% in some areas, even before the English really settled in large numbers. This massive loss of life fundamentally weakened indigenous society's ability to resist colonization.
A tragic, unintended consequence that dramatically shifted the balance of power.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, the financing model shifted too, towards these joint stock companies.
Spreading the risk among investors.
Right. It made these incredibly risky ventures more feasible. And the companies were focused on profit-finding commodities that would sell back in England. Propagandists like the Hackloots kept pushing the commercial potential alongside the religious justifications.
Which brings us to Jamestown in 1607. The first permanent English settlement, but it sounds like it nearly wasn't.
Oh, Jamestown's early years were brutal. The Virginia Company got the charter, set off for the Chesapeake Bay with high hopes. Find gold, claim land, get resources, find that Northwest Passage, convert the natives, employ England's poor. A long list.
A lot riding on it.
Yeah.
And the joint stock model meant pressure for profit.
Huge pressure. Investors wanted returns, which pushed the colonists towards things like hunting for gold instead of, planting crops to survive.
And the location itself wasn't ideal.
Terrible location. Swampy, bad water, prone to diseases like malaria and typhoid. Plus, they landed right at the start of a major drought that lasted for years.
So bad luck and bad planning combined.
And terrible leadership, initially.
Yeah.
Lots of gentlemen who weren't used to or willing to do hard labor. The whole model was flawed, focused on extracting wealth rather than building a sustainable community. Mortality rates were astronomical.
Which led to the starving time. That sounds grim.
It was horrific. The winter of 1609-1610. Supplies ran out, a resupply fleet got scattered by a storm, and the local Powhatan people, led by Chief Powhatan, essentially besieged the fort.
Trapped inside with no food.
Pretty much. They ate anything, horses, dogs, rats, even leather from shoes. There are documented, credible accounts of cannibalism. It's hard to overstate how desperate it was.
How many survived?
Out of maybe 400 or so settlers before the winter, only about 60 were left by spring. It was purely down to English unpreparedness, their rigid social structure, and just a completely failed strategy.
It's amazing they didn't just give up.
They almost did. In June 1610, the survivors were actually sailing away, abandoning Jamestown, when ships arrived under Lord De La Warr with fresh supplies and men. Just in the nick of time.
Incredible timing. You mentioned leadership issues. Was there anyone who actually helped them survive those early years?
Captain John Smith is the key figure here. He was controversial, definitely, but he imposed discipline. Famously declared, "He that will not work shall not eat."
Practical, if harsh.
He had to be. He was also crucial in negotiating, sometimes demanding, food from the Powhatan Confederacy. Without Smith, it's very likely Jamestown would have collapsed entirely in those first couple of years.
So, the relationship with the Powhatan Confederacy was critical. What was that like?
Very complex. Well, Hunsanecaw, or Powhatan, the paramount chief, was a shrewd leader. Initially, there was some curiosity, trade. The English needed Powhatan food and knowledge to survive. Powhatan likely saw the English as potential assets or maybe rivals to manage within his own political sphere.
Not simple friends or enemies then.
No, much more nuanced. A lot of pragmatic dealing, trying to figure each other out, punctuated by tension and misunderstandings. English dependence was high at first.
And our main source for a lot of this is John Smith himself. How reliable is he?
That's the challenge. Smith's accounts are invaluable, but you have to read them critically. He was definitely interested in promoting his own role, and his perspective is entirely Eurocentric.
What about the famous Pocahontas story, saving Smith's life?
That's heavily debated. Some historians think it happened maybe as a ritual adoption ceremony Smith misunderstood. Others think he embellished it or even made it up later to make his adventure sound more dramatic.
But the story itself became powerful.
Hugely powerful. It got woven into this romanticized myth of colonization, painting hardship as overcomable, maybe downplaying the violence and ignoring indigenous perspectives. Pocahontas became a symbol, but one that often obscures the reality for her people.
Which is crucial trying to see it from the Powhatan viewpoint. They were facing invaders, fundamentally.
Absolutely. They were dealing with people settling on their land, disrupting their lives, demanding resources. Archaeology is helping us see more of their side, their settlements around Jamestown, their interactions. They weren't just passive victims. They had strategies, they resisted, they made choices.
Then came tobacco. That seems to be the thing that finally made Jamestown viable.
Yes, John Rolfe, who later married Pocahontas, introduced a new, sweeter strain of tobacco around 1612, probably seeds from the Spanish Caribbean.
And it took off.
Big time. It was hugely popular in England. Tobacco exports exploded. Suddenly, Virginia had a cash crop, something that could actually make the colony profitable and sustainable.
So tobacco saved Jamestown, but it sounds like it created a whole new set of problems.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It led to a monoculture. Everything revolved around tobacco. It exhausted the soil incredibly quickly, which meant a constant driving need for more land.
Pushing further into indigenous territory.
Inevitably. And it was incredibly labor-intensive. Cultivating and processing tobacco required a huge workforce.
So demand for land and demand for labor became the driving forces. Did the peace associated with Rolfe and Pocahontas' marriage last?
It created a lull, the Peace of Pocahontas, from 1614 for a few years. That period was crucial for the tobacco boom to get going. But the underlying conflict over land hadn't gone away. There had already been the First Anglo-Powhatan War before that peace.
And the expansion for tobacco farming reignited the conflict.
Yes. Powhatan's successor, Opechancanough, saw the English encroachment becoming unbearable. In 1622, he launched a coordinated surprise attack that killed about a third of the English colonists, around 347 people.
A devastating blow to the colony. How did the English respond?
With overwhelming force and a shift in rhetoric. Figures like Edward Waterhouse framed the attack as unprovoked, barbarous treachery, justifying, in their minds, a war of extermination and the seizure of Powhatan lands. This kicked off the Second Anglo-Powhatan War.
A perpetual war, as they call it.
That was the policy. It was brutal, lasting about a decade. And conflicts flared up again later.
The Third Anglo-Powhatan War.
In the 1640s, Opechancanough, now quite old, led another major resistance effort. He was eventually captured and murdered while imprisoned. That really broke the back of the Confederacy as a major political or military force.
What happened to the Powhatan people after that?
Treaties confined the survivors to small reservations. Their land was taken, their power destroyed. By the late 1600s, many English colonists essentially considered them extinct as a distinct political entity.
A tragic outcome directly linked to the economics of tobacco. And to get the labor for that tobacco, you mentioned the headright system. How did that work?
Introduced in 1618, it granted 50 acres of land for every person whose passage to Virginia was paid for. If you paid your own way, you got 50 acres. If a wealthy planter paid for an indentured servant to come over, the planter got the 50 acres.
So it incentivized bringing people over, especially laborers.
Exactly. It fueled immigration and the importation of indentured servants who formed the bulk of the labor force initially. They'd work for, say, 4 to 7 years to pay off their passage.
But it also concentrated land ownership.
Hugely. Wealthy individuals could amass vast estates by paying for many passages. It baked social and economic inequality into the system from early on. And crucially, it also paved the way for slavery.
How so? Did paying for an enslaved person's passage also grant land?
Initially, yes. That provided yet another incentive, beyond the labor itself, for planters to start importing enslaved Africans.
This brings us squarely to the development of slavery. The demand for tobacco labor seems like the primary driver in shifting from temporary indentured servitude to permanent racialized slavery.
It was the crucial economic engine behind it. The arrival of that first group of Africans in 1619 on the White Lion, maybe 20 in odd individuals, taken from a Portuguese slave ship bound for Mexico, marks the beginning.
Their status wasn't immediately clear, was it? Were they treated as slaves for life right away?
It's debated. Some evidence suggests some might have been treated like indentured servants initially, with the possibility of freedom. But that ambiguity didn't last long. This was English North America's entry point into the much larger, established Atlantic slave trade system.
Right, slavery existed elsewhere. This is about how it took root and evolved in the English colonies. What made it shift decisively from indenture to race-based slavery?
Several things converged. Indentured servitude was temporary. Servants eventually became free, needed land, could become competitors, or even potential rebels. Bacon's rebellion in 1676 really spooked the planter elite, a revolt involving former indentured servants and enslaved Africans.
Fear of the white underclass joining forces with the enslaved?
Exactly. Also, conditions in England eventually improved somewhat, so fewer people were desperate enough to sign up for indenture. And critically, the supply of enslaved Africans increased, especially after the Royal African Company got its charter in 1672, making it more systematic and profitable.
So enslaved labor became seen as more permanent, more controllable, and more economically reliable for the planters.
Yes, and this wasn't just an organic shift. It was actively constructed through laws. Colonial legislatures, particularly in Virginia, began passing laws that specifically defined slavery, linked it to African ancestry, and stripped away rights.
Can you give some examples of those key laws?
Sure. As early as 1640, you have the John Punch case, where he, a black runaway servant, got servitude for life, while the white servants with him only got extended terms. By 1661, Virginia law formally acknowledges slavery.
And then laws that made it hereditary.
Crucially, the 1662 law, Partus Sequitur Ventrum. This meant a child's status followed the mother. So children born to enslaved women were automatically slaves, regardless of the father's status. This locked people in generation after generation.
What about religion? Did baptism offer a path to freedom?
They closed that loophole too. A 1667 law explicitly stated that baptism did not change an enslaved person's status.
Dehumanizing laws followed too.
Yes. A 1669 law basically gave masters immunity if they killed an enslaved person during punishment or correction. Then you get acts restricting movement, assembly, the right to bear arms like the 1680 Act trying to prevent insurrections.
And eventually, comprehensive slave codes.
The Virginia Slave Codes of 1705 really consolidated things. They defined slaves based on non-Christian origin, effectively meaning non-white, stripped away almost all legal rights, established separate courts, and unequivocally defined enslaved people as property, as chattel. They even specified only white men should be armed.
It's chilling. A deliberate legal architecture to create and maintain racialized slavery for profit and control.
Absolutely. Race was being actively constructed as the primary basis for enslavement and legal status.
And this model, developed largely in Virginia due to tobacco, spread as colonization moved south.
Yes, the later southern colonies, Maryland, the Carolinas, Georgia, largely followed this pattern. Staple crop agriculture, reliance on unfree labor evolving towards racial slavery, and often violent relations with indigenous peoples.
Let's touch on those. Maryland.
Founded 1632 by Lord Baltimore, initially intended as a haven for English Catholics. They had a headright system like Virginia's.
And that famous Toleration Act?
The 1649 Act granted freedom of worship, but only to Trinitarian Christians. And it had harsh penalties for blasphemy. Plus, it didn't apply to non-Christians. It was also fragile eventually. Anglicanism became the established church, and Catholics faced restrictions again.
Economically, did it end up like Virginia?
Pretty much. Tobacco became dominant, and they made the same shift from indentured servants to relying heavily on enslaved African labor. Early relations with local tribes like the Piscataway involved trade, but eventually led to conflict and displacement.
Okay, what about the influence from the Caribbean? That seems important for the Carolinas.
Hugely important. English colonies like Barbados underwent a sugar revolution in the mid-1600s. Sugar was incredibly profitable, but demanded massive amounts of labor under brutal conditions.
So, Caribbean slavery was particularly harsh.
Exceptionally brutal. High mortality rates, extreme working conditions, and very repressive slave codes. The Barbados Slave Code of 1661 became a model defining slaves as chattel, giving masters near absolute power.
And this influenced the mainland.
Directly. Carolina, chartered in 1663, had many early settlers come from Barbados. They brought their plantation system and their slave codes with them.
The fundamental constitutions of Carolina even mention slavery explicitly.
Yes, written partly by John Locke, ironically. It granted freemen absolute power and authority over their enslaved people. Early Carolina also involved trade in deer skins and, disturbingly, a significant trade enslaving indigenous people.
But then rice transformed South Carolina.
Yes. Starting in the late 17th century, rice cultivation was incredibly well suited to the low country environment, but like sugar, it was labor-intensive. This led to a massive increase in importing enslaved Africans, often specifically from rice-growing regions of West Africa, bringing their expertise.
Indigo, too.
Indigo became another important cash crop later. This influx of Africans meant that by the early 18th century, coastal South Carolina had a black majority population.
Which led to unique cultural developments.
Right, like the Gullah Geechee culture, which retained strong African linguistic and cultural elements, partly due to the concentration of Africans and the task system of labor used on rice plantations, which sometimes allowed more autonomy than gang labor.
But also resistance, like the Stono Rebellion?
Yes, the Stono Rebellion in 1739 was a major uprising. The response was the Negro Act of 1740, making South Carolina's already harsh slave code even more restrictive, limiting assembly, education, movement, earning money.
And Carolina eventually split.
Yes, North and South Carolina formally divided in 1712. North Carolina's economy was different, less reliant on large plantations and a massive enslaved populations initially, focusing more on naval stores and smaller farms.
Finally, Georgia, founded much later with different initial aims.
Founded in 1732 by James Oglethorpe. It was partly philanthropic, a place for England's debtors, and partly strategic, a military buffer against Spanish Florida.
And they initially banned slavery.
Yes, along with rum and large landholdings. The idea was small farms, worked by European immigrants, producing things like silk and wine. Slavery was seen as incompatible with the social goals and military liability near the Spanish border.
But the ban didn't last.
No. Many settlers, called the malcontents, looked at South Carolina's wealth from rice and indigo, based on enslaved labor, and wanted the same. People started bringing enslaved people in illegally. The military justification weakened after Oglethorpe had some successes against the Spanish.
So economic pressure won out.
Pretty much. The trustees gave in and legalized slavery around 1750-51. After that, Georgia quickly started to look a lot like South Carolina, with rice and indigo plantations worked by enslaved Africans becoming central to its economy.
Despite Oglethorpe having relatively better relations with some local indigenous groups initially?
Yes, he had a notable alliance with Tomochichi and the Yamacraw Creek, facilitated by Mary Musgrove as an interpreter. But the eventual economic model based on plantation slavery inevitably led to increased pressure on indigenous lands, similar to elsewhere.
So, across the South, English expansion meant continuous conflict and displacement for indigenous nations. It wasn't empty land.
Not at all. It was a landscape inhabited by numerous diverse nations. Initial encounters involved trade, sometimes alliances. Europeans often exploited existing rivalries. But the relentless English hunger for land, different ideas about ownership, abuses in trade, and disease constantly undermined relationships.
Leading to major wars.
Yes, like the Tuscarora War in North Carolina around 1711. Caused by encroachment, unfair trade, enslavement of Tuscarora people. They fought back, were defeated, many killed or enslaved, and survivors migrated north. It opened up more land for colonists.
And the Yamasee War in South Carolina.
A few years later, 1715, a broader coalition led by the Yamasee rose up against similar abuses: debt, land grabs, the slave trade. They had initial successes, but the colonists, crucially aided by the Cherokee, eventually defeated them. The Yamasee were largely driven into Florida. This war also led South Carolina to rely even more heavily on African slavery rather than indigenous enslavement.
What about treaties? Weren't agreements made?
Treaties were made, but they were rarely agreements between equals, often negotiated after conflicts, with indigenous groups weakened, language barriers, different concepts of land ownership. Europeans often exploited these ambiguities, and colonists frequently violated the terms anyway. Treaties often became tools to legitimize taking land.
And throughout all this, religion remained a factor.
Yes, Protestantism was a core part of English identity and a justification for competing with Catholic Spain. The idea of a civilizing mission converting indigenous people was always there, even if often secondary to profit and land. Belief in English cultural and religious superiority helped rationalize taking land and asserting authority.
Especially after conflicts like the 1622 attack.
Exactly. Events like that were used to portray indigenous people as savage heathens, justifying violence and dispossession in the name of bringing true religion and civilization.
And the Church of England itself, what was its role in the colonies?
It was the established church in most southern colonies, supported by taxes. It reinforced the social order, with wealthy planters often serving as vestrymen, controlling local church affairs.
Did the church challenge slavery?
Generally, no. It accommodated slavery. Parishes sometimes owned enslaved people. Religious teachings were often used to encourage obedience among the enslaved. That 1667 Virginia law saying baptism didn't free someone is key here. Missionary groups existed, but their efforts didn't fundamentally challenge the system.
So the social order that developed was hierarchical, based on English norms, but adapted to the colonial reality.
Right. English culture came over, but it was shaped by the new environment, high mortality rates, interactions with indigenous and African cultures, and the dispersed settlement patterns in the South. There were internal tensions, too, class conflicts like Bacon's Rebellion, challenges from other Protestant groups to Anglican dominance.
Looking back at this whole period, this planting of English America, what are the main takeaways?
Well, it's crucial to see it wasn't simple settlement. It was complex, often brutal, deeply contested. Two themes really define it: the dispossession of indigenous peoples and the rise of race-based chattel slavery.
Immense human cost, driven by economics, but often cloaked in ideology.
Precisely. Economic goals were paramount, justified by ideas about religion and civilization. We see indigenous people constantly resisting, adapting, negotiating, but ultimately facing overwhelming force and devastating diseases. And we see the beginnings of the African American experience, marked by the horrific resilience needed to survive enslavement.
It really forces us to look beyond the traditional narratives and confront the violence and exploitation involved. Acknowledging the perspectives of those who lost their land or were enslaved is essential.
Absolutely. Colonization was often about uprooting, not just planting. And the legacies of that era, the dispossession, the racial hierarchies, are things we're still grappling with today.
Which leads to a final thought for you, the listener. Considering these economic drivers and ideological justifications from centuries ago, how do they still echo in our current discussions about land, race, justice, and who we are as a nation? What's our responsibility now in understanding these deep historical roots?
Something to reflect on. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes. Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.